Troy Stevens. We are too nice, it seems. I'm with you, brother. Not that I want to change that, but I'm with you. Contra the left's claims, we as a culture are kind, patient, and tolerant to a fault, as evidenced by the fact that we pay them to complain about us and brainwash our kids. How can we keep this rightly prized kindness of spirit, which seems to enable progressivism's incrementalist advance, from becoming our undoing? That may be the question of the age. Well, my first answer is to just kind of look at history and realize that good people, morally good people, because basically what you're saying is, you're absolutely right, the left is using our moral decency against us, our willingness to obey the rules, all of that stuff. They're using all of that against us. And so if we continue to be this forgiving and kind and tolerant and all these other things, which we actually are, then progressivism is like the HIV virus. It comes into the system and attacks the self-defense mechanisms. It makes you feel guilty for defending your own culture. It makes you feel guilty for being proud of who you are. It makes you feel that you live in the worst place in the world and that everything about you and your country and your existence is hateful. And so you are not willing to defend the republic, which means you're a white blood cell that's not able to defend the body. It's an autoimmune disease is what progressivism is. But I think the only answer to this is that it has been, it's been proven to my satisfaction. And I have I like to think I have a relatively realistic view of human nature. So this is not just wishful thinking on my part. I'm basing this on history. I believe that it is possible for people like us, for decent people who are mostly just want to be left alone, naturally friendly people who are more than willing to trade and all the rest of it. I believe it is possible for people like us to realize that we are in the kind of dirty fight where we either play by their rules or we lose. And that playing by their, this is the key point because this is the point of your question. Playing by their rules means playing by their rules for the duration. It doesn't mean becoming them. It means fighting them on their level for as long as we have to. And so the critical point, the whole thing turns on whether or not it's capable, you're capable of going back to the first condition if you decide to go to the second one. And I think we are. I know that the example I keep using, because just I can't think of a better one, is that in the Pacific we fight the Japanese, and at first when they surrender, and I mean at first, I'm talking about first days in Guadalcanal, we have a moral code that says that once a soldier's been wounded, he's out of action, and since he's no longer a threat, if we have the resources available, then we should treat him, and that we no longer have a fight with this particular guy because he's no longer a combatant. So we send medics out to attend to wounded Japanese, and it turns out that when the medics and stretcher bearers get there, the guy's holding a hand grenade and kills himself and takes 4 or 5 Americans with him. And when this happens all the time, not just once, when it happens all the time, any adult can make the moral calculation here. Their behavior is forcing me to abandon my fundamental humanity because they are going to use that to kill me. And that's my choice. I can either be a compassionate person, I can either be a dead compassionate person or a living person who's made the conscious decision that the morality that I would apply to just about anybody does not apply to these people based on the fact that their ethical system's completely different than ours. So the Marines ended up fighting the Japanese the way the Japanese fought the Marines. They didn't start it, and they didn't lead with it, but they sure ended with it. And that's That's what I would say. My point is that if you're a Marine in World War II and you had to fight that kind of brutal war, millions of them did, and not just in Japan and Germany as well. And while I think the entire greatest generation, the ones that were actually deployed, now I'm not talking about I'm talking about the people actually in uniform. And I don't even mean in combat, I mean the ones who are actually just in uniform. I think that the greatest generation on some level really did suffer from a form of PTSD. Obviously, that doesn't apply to every single individual, but if you want to generalize about it as a generation, I think the reason that they're so emotionally distant is that they had been so traumatized, not just by the war, but by the Depression as kids. And that was the price they paid for saving the world. But watching Americans come back from dealing with Japanese, with those kind of strategies and tactics, rather, and coming back from seeing what happened in the death camps, they didn't come back home as monsters. They came back home as decent people. In other words, they were brutal while they had to be, but the fundamental goodness in them, I don't want to say it wasn't touched by that. I think it was. I think they had nightmares for the rest of their lives because of this. But it didn't own them. And in the microscopic number of cases where in World War II or Vietnam or whatever, a good man goes to Vietnam and comes back a murderer, those cases are so small that they essentially statistically don't exist. The tragedy is that what does statistically exist in a very significant way is that a lot of those people come back, and because they're so decent people and they don't want to hurt anybody else, they have no place to put this pain, so they end up killing themselves. As the federal government gets more and more intense and pushes more and more into our lives, and we fight against it more and more, I've been watching 10 years now as Abraham Lincoln has come under more and more and more fire from conservatives. And I just think that's wrong. Without question, Abraham Lincoln assumed a lot of dictatorial powers as commander-in-chief that were not authorized by the Constitution. And he was the first person to say it. He was the first one to admit it. And his bet, because that's what it was, his bet was that the country was strong enough to bend the Constitution in order to save it. And if it saves it, then perhaps it will unbend. But if it doesn't get saved, what difference does it make bending the Constitution? If it's broken, what difference does it make? So I think there's enough evidence historically for us, for Americans as a people. I can't speak for other peoples, but there are national characteristics that are caused by a lot of different things, climate and all the rest of it. But America's a nation of people who came here to be independent and who didn't want to be told what to do. And that is a kind of self-selection. And those people tend to be very kind and very decent. And until recently, kind and decent and tough. But when you take away all threats for 2 or 3 generations, you shouldn't be surprised to find a generation that thinks that threats don't exist. Let's go to the Facebook page, shall we? I saw 1 or 2 questions up there that looked really kind of interesting.